everybody.
Yes.
How are you?
Good.
Thank you for coming. I'm thrilled that you're here tonight, and this is, I think, just a wonderful beginning to our celebration for this year's Rilke winner, Allison Benis White, who has just flown in from California to dazzle us with her thoughts and her poetry tonight. This is the 7th year that we've awarded the Rilke Prize, and I'm incredibly proud of the list we put together. I was just thinking about how terrific the books are that we've chosen year after year for this award. And I'm grateful for the work that Bruce Bond and Jean Dubrow have done helping me group through all the books that come in. This year there were 200 books that were entered for this contest, right? And I think this new book, Please Bury Me in This, from Allison, is a worthy addition to the list. And I'm very happy to have it to add to the list. I think it proves that we have fantastic taste. And in the comment earlier, Allison and I were talking about this, and she said, Corey, I think it was you. It was you, yeah. It's that sparkling water.
It's a sparkling water. I set it down.
You've got to be careful.
It's a short.
Yeah, exactly.
Shorts.
Yeah, you can turn it off. We probably don't need it.
So before we continue, I think it's probably wise for us to watch a short safety video. Maybe not. But so I'm thrilled that Allison's going to talk to us tonight about her book. I want to remind you that tomorrow night she'll give a reading at 8 o'clock over in the Business Leadership Building in room 180. So please come to that event as well. She's maybe going to read a couple of poems tonight, but you want to hear the full deal tomorrow night, I think. There are books here today, there are books there tomorrow. Make sure you're buying books as well, please. So, this is her third book, right? So this is a prize where you have to have published at least 2 books previously, and then you can qualify with your third book, which means that Allison got to us about as quickly as she could with this terrific third book. Her earlier books were also prize winners. One won the first book won the Cleveland State Poetry Center Book Prize. She won the Levis Prize from 4-Way Books for her second book. The book was chosen by Claudia Rankin. And now she's won the Rilke Prize from us. She teaches creative writing at UC Riverside. So I know you're going to talk to her a lot about the book. You might ask her too about how you can get into her program as well. She's ready to talk about that as well. She's the graduate advisor there. So please bury me in this. I think one of the ways that we choose the winners is we read through all these books and we wait to see what we have to go back to, what we keep remembering, what we have to revisit, reread, re-experience. And I think this book quickly rose to that category for us, and it made itself the clear winner out of those 200 books this year. And I think it's a really striking book. We say that we want to celebrate exceptional artistry and vision, and I think this is a book that demonstrates both of those things. It's a book-length sequence of prose poems that speaks out of the intense, isolating pressure of loss and grief. It tries to put words to that experience, but it also recognizes in the process that those words, as she says in one of her early poems, are marked by spectacular lack as well. Right? And there's a terrific moment in an interview with Allison that I read that I think I want to just quickly read to you because I feel like it illuminates so much about this book. She says, "Language cannot resolve grief or contain it, but it can sometimes make a box, a poem, a book, within which something alive, heat-producing, can be experienced." And these poems, despite their subject matter, are alive and full of heat. And I'd love to hear you come up and talk about them. So let us welcome Allison.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful introduction.
And would you maybe read to us a little bit, and then we'll dive into questions?
I'll read a couple poems, and poems that I chose to read are both explicitly about the act of writing, which I assume we will discuss this evening. And as Corey said, this is a book-length series, and the poems don't have titles, as they all exist underneath the title of the book, which is Please Bury Me in This. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I am drawing a window in the air around my face, something to speak through. We took turns once in my room, tracing letters on each other's backs, each letter overlapping, erasing the last one. We will swallow each other, I thought, my hair in a wet braid. I want to fold this page into an accordion, pinch one end into a fan. Imagine the end of desire, the palm erasing the skin. She wrote on my back, slowly. I was invisible before this happened. Imagine these words as the ends of fingers. In a letter found buried near a gas chamber. Dear finder, search everywhere, in every inch of soil. Around the perimeter, several other letters in jars, so many in my father's family. As they lined up to die, one letter said, some sang, some were stoic. Even among the haunted, each of us wants to live long enough to write down her name and reason. I wrote, what is more beautiful than the hopeless singing? Dear finder, listen. So I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have about this book. And again, I will read much more tomorrow evening. Yes.
So when I was reading the book, I couldn't help but think of Liam Neeson's comments. Don't Let Me Be Lonely by Claudia Rilke, North Border by Nick Gould. Do you have any books in mind that you see directly in conversation with what you've written?
I am an enormous fan of Don't Let Me Be Lonely, in particular, and by Claudia Rankine, and that I think that book absolutely influenced this book. I think also Beth Bachman's Temper and Nick Flynn's Blind Humor was an interesting book that I feel like informed this in some ways. And then always going back to Anne Carson, The Glass Essay. I mean, really, I'm making a list of books I love. And so inherently, I think there is an influence there. Those were the books that I had open on my desk when I was writing this book. And at the same time, I think as a writer, one hopes that you're tapping into something particular that is influenced, but that is also distinct. And for me, that's the nature of writing, is listening very intently to trying to find a tone that I wouldn't say so much that's unique to me, but that is not simply imitative. So I think that's always a challenge as far as influence and love. And so my hope is to read widely and deeply, so my influences are various, so that I'm in conversation, but not in imitation. So thank you, though, for bringing up, in particular, Don't Let Me Be Lonely. To me, that's an extraordinary compliment to be referred to in the same sentence as that book. Thank you. I know you have questions.
What other art forms have art influenced by your work? And what ways?
Yeah, I mean, my first book was an acrostic book in response to Degas' paintings. So in that way, I was influenced directly in this collusion or this confluence with looking at his paintings and finding language in some way through the meditation on the images. And that book, and that's Self-Portrait with Crayon, I feel is the most explicit way my work was influenced by another artist that wasn't a writer. And I puzzled over why that was true. I think, and then came to understand in some ways that book is also a series in which I'm responding to different Degas paintings, sketches, and sculptures, and came to understand in some ways that what I wanted to write about, or what I needed to write about, was lacked narrative entirely. And so looking at the paintings and writing into the space of the still moment and the still woman, usually, or women in the paintings, was extremely liberating and allowed me to experience company while I was writing in a way that's different than writing with other books open. And I did that a little bit too. I have another manuscript that I wrote in part, in one section, as a response to a series of photographs. And so that is very rich for me. And I mean, in this book, of course, there's other writers and lines from writers' letters and books strung through it. So in that way, I suppose there's an active conversation as well. But I think that's the hope, right? Is that we're together in this, and that we are responding to one another, and that there. And I enjoyed the experience of like traditional ekphrasis because it allows for that conversation to transcend language, which in some ways I always feel like poetry is trying to do with language what cannot be done with language. And if I could paint, and more importantly, if I could sing, I mean, I feel like that's so much closer in some ways to more immediate, maybe not closer as the word, but more immediate as far as artistic expression and consumption. But I feel like that's what I'm trying to do in my cage here with language, is try to create the experience of a painting or a song. And I think, am I touching it?
It's just electrons having a hard time.
But I'm trying to create an emotional experience, I think, more than anything, and a visual experience, and of course an experience of rhythm and hypnosis. Although that's kind of an odd word to use, but y'all know what I mean.
Just since you're talking about that, it's sort of a book about the longing to construct, sort of a hopeless longing in some ways to construct bridges of all different kinds. And so the intertextuality is fun. And of course the longing to commune with the dead. But there's also this other sense of the body and the mind, or the body and the spirit, and the words turning into flesh. There's something sacramental expressed there. The desire to do that at the same time. The next poem might negate that. In other words, it might say this is impossible. Okay. So, but you talk about the imminent materiality of the painting or music. Even. I mean, it's sensuous as well. Immediate. That said, if you have that, you kind of deprive yourself of that very thing in poetry that makes it come alive, which is that hopeless thing, that sense of fathomless hunger, that is conceptual. I'm wondering, if you could say a little bit more about why poetry is phenomenal. Why it doesn't rock? What does it do that the painting and music cannot do?
For me, it cuts through even more powerfully. It's like a station I was able to tune into that transcended painting, that transcended music. I don't know if I can explain it. I feel like when I heard poems for the first time, and for me specifically, however cliche this is, I remember reading Plath's Tulips. I remember reading Anne Sexton's Unknown Girl in a Maternity Ward and feeling destroyed, feeling transformed, feeling a kind of intimacy that I hadn't experienced with painting or music or other art forms. I felt like I was being spoken to directly. and I felt like I was alone with the speaker. And a friend of mine says poetry, and this is kind of an odd thing to say, but I understand what it means. Poetry, like prayer, is spoken to one person at a time, or one entity at a time. There's a feeling of truly being in a space where the voice is pushing as hard as it can through the wall of separation into the ear of whomever is listening, or the particular person who's listening. But that phenomenon is difficult to articulate entirely beyond, for me, what I've just done. And I feel like there is, it's communion. It's a communion, and it feels also like you quoted my something I said in an interview, that the heartbeat exists most powerfully for me through language in this stark way, as a reader and then as a writer. It is not lesser than any other art form. It just it's less popular and it's less accessible often for the average reader. But in that way, there is an exceptional specialness to it. And I sort of I have what I call private books, personal books that are not popular, but I feel like they're mine, and I will recommend them. One book is this book called Catchlight by Sarah O'Brien. I feel like that's my private book. It's mine in the way that my relationship with my husband is mine. It transcends any social relationship or any artistic relationship that I've experienced. I could hear it. And then totally surprisingly, and by it I mean poetry, I could speak back into that space which I was hearing a voice emerge from. Which that's really the most startling part. It's not hearing, it's actually being able to respond. That I'm still startled by. And I don't experience myself as a person. I was rereading some of this work in anticipation of reading tomorrow night, and I still don't experience myself as someone who made it. And I think that's useful. In a way, it's disorienting, but it's useful in that I feel that when I come to the page, I come to the page without confidence. I come to the page with desperation and hopelessness, shot through with hope of reaching.
Could you talk a little bit about the process of ordering the collection when it was still a manuscript, especially given that the poems don't have titles and that there's no really discernible traditional linear narrative throughout, at least for a first-time reader?
Right. I think ordering a manuscript is, at least for me as a writer of poetry, has been a mind-bendingly challenging process. My first book, the way I ordered it, and I ordered this book in a similar way, it was just swifter. My first book, I knew what the first poem was, and I kind of knew what the last poem was, and I knew, this poem, you can't put that in too early because it's saying some crazy shit, right? That's got to be a little bit later, So I knew things like that, some basic orienting anchors. But the way that this is very similar to the way that I write the individual poem, and it is a different skill set, I believe, ordering a manuscript versus writing an individual poem. I mean, the whole nature of the act of the poet is that we work in miniature, and that we can excel in miniature. And so I think then thinking in terms of a book was really odd. But the way I organized my first book is I read the first poem, and then I listened for what the second poem would be, and then I read the first two poems, and then I listened for the third poem, and so on. Exactly like that. I read the first 20 poems and then listened for the 21st poem. It was maddening, but I didn't know how else to do it because it's so much about sound. And when I say sound, when I say listening, I mean it's obviously musical, but it's also imagistic, and it's also just relational and associative and emotional. So I all three of my books I've ordered in that fashion. So it's very much in the mud of it. I did know with this book what the first poem would be when I wrote it. I thought, oh, okay, that would begin this, and I had a sense of what would be the end, or near the end. But it was all about listening and just being inside it as much as I could. And it's been, I feel like I've developed that skill set. The first book, I remember I was teaching at UCI at the time, and I was carrying the pages around everywhere, and I remember like spreading the pages out in my classroom and looking up, and class was supposed to be starting. I'm like, hold on, everybody. Like, I was really like just taking it with me everywhere, trying to listen. And so the second book and the third book, it happened a little more swiftly, and I had a little more confidence because I had done it before and it had functioned. But I remember with this book as well, finally reading through the manuscript once I had ordered it and thinking, oh, okay, I hear there's like a click, and I felt like it's alive. And I remember I went and took a shower. Like, that was like, I sure like just, like, oh, like I think I did it, because I didn't know, and I don't know with any of the books, if they're really truly books until I start organizing them. There's the hope for that. There's a certain trust that I have. As one of my professors said, your concerns will reveal themselves. Don't worry, they will. Or this sort of trust that the relationships between the poems are inherent, and I just have to discover them. Meaning, like, there's some trust that this is a book, that I just have to find a way to manifest it together. But I'm never sure. I'm never sure until it's complete. And also, I don't know if this is useful, but what I do as a process is I write until I like to write short, meaning I want to write until I have about 50 pages, which is a standard manuscript length, and then see what I have. With the first book, I recall, I remember thinking, I'm just going to keep writing because they were in a series until I don't have anything to say anymore, until it burns out. And what had happened was I wrote something and I realized, oh, I've already said that. And then I tried again and I'm like, I've already said that. And I tried a third time, same result. And that signaled to me that the book was complete, or the manuscript, or the hope for a manuscript was complete. And so with that, I tried also, and I still do this in the process of making, to avoid thinking about it holistically until I know I have enough pages, and then just hoping that it will cohere in some way. And also, like, I like the argument that the book of poems is the long poem. And so, just like writing a poem, you don't know until you get to the end if it really is going to have that sizzle or click, or the match is going to be lit. And that's how I feel about the book as well. You could have a bunch of great individual pieces, but my goal as a writer, what I'm obsessed with, is the book-length series, or the long poem that interests me most. You're talking about books that influenced. When I read The Wild Iris, I freaked out. I thought, oh my God, she's done it. And the immediate response is, I never can write again, because she said it. She said it so brilliantly and so perfectly. And then, of course, the despair evaporates a little bit, and I think, well, maybe I can say something differently. But I've always been very interested in the idea of the book. Interested in individual poem as well, but I was totally fascinated by the idea of a book of poetry that could be read from beginning to end. And I also understood that was quite a task to produce, but I wanted to do it. And I knew it was going to take a long time. I remember that too, thinking, oh God, this is going to be hard, And it is. It's all challenging, I think. But this part in particular, one little tiny piece of, not really advice, because I haven't really employed it, but I liked a lot about ordering a manuscript, is, and this is from Sandra Beasley, I think, and she said, think about, and this is, I guess, sort of intuitively what I'm doing. She's like, come to the last line of the poem and then think about the first line of the next poem as being literally the next line. I mean, which is a way of listening, which I really appreciated also because it's tangible, it's practical, thinking about them truly strung together in that way. But, I mean, I'm writing something right now and I feel like, I have no idea. Hopefully I'll find out eventually how it hangs together.
Can I quickly follow up on that? It seems like the pauses in this book are so important. Mm-hmm. So you have it in sections.
Yes.
And I'm taking with this idea that you're listening at the end of the poem for the next poem, but how do you hear the place where you need the silence that both is kind of, I think, calling back towards the beginning of that sequence and imagining what comes next.
So you're asking about the sections in particular?
How do you come to that? How do you find the pause? How do you know what the sections are?
The sections, I think of the sections as waves, as sort of something gathering and then crashing, and also thinking of them like just like the traditional short story, the rising action, the climax, the falling action. So I think of it in those terms, and also it gives me, as a person who's working in a genre that's miniature, it gives me smaller spaces to work with, and that's really useful in organizing. But I feel like it's just the same thing as writing an individual poem. You hear you hear the climax. You hear that there needs to be rest now, that something has been arrived at, and that silence should follow that. I always like what Louise Glück said, that the aspiration of a poem is silence. And the way I understood that was that you're coming to a place where there is nothing left to say. And so I think in the sections, it's coming to a space in which there should be silence and there should be a chance to absorb, and also just there needs to be a break. like it's too much. It's too much. Even though these poems are so sparse, there's a feeling of too much. And maybe that's also the response. I'm just thinking of this at this moment, like the need for concision is also, I think, a response just personally to feeling like there's too much, and trying to create a space of silence and listening, and brevity, and where there's the essential. It seems to be very important. But to go back to your question, I think those sections really are individual poems in a sense, or I think of them in that way, and just like we need that pause, we need the pause, and I've done that in each of my books. I've had sections, which is not uncommon, but is a great tool for the person who thinks on a smaller scale. But again, it's like to figure out if it's right, it's just about rereading and rereading and rereading. It's really a madness more than anything, with wheels. It's really kind of extraordinary to look back and think about what one has done, the time one has spent. Oh my God. I remember talking to this one young woman who's at a wedding, and she's a writer, and she's talking to me about writing, and I'm like, yeah, I just spent 3 days on 2 words. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the idea of the devotion and the session and the madness of this and the beauty of it, the labor of it, sort of daunting for me anyway. But this is who I am. This is what I'm doing with my time here on Earth, is trying to make something alive. And that devotion has not burned itself out. I still want it as much as I did, I think, in the beginning when I heard it. And I think that's the hopelessness and the spectacular lack, is because whatever articulation one achieves, I don't know what your experience is, but when I write something and it works, I feel relief and accomplishment for, I think it's about 36 hours before the desire comes back and the feeling of like, oh, that wasn't enough. I need to revisit this and push forward. Yes.
I'm particularly drawn to the way that you move from line to line. There's a leap there that is disconnected, but it feels like a progression. I'm wondering what that particular composition process is like. How do you find the connection between
I'm sorry?
between two pictures or images?
I think that is also an act of deep listening. And I think I've always had a very good ability. I was talking to Lisa Vining when we were driving from the airport, and I was saying, I have a terrible sense of direction. Terrible. I'm so grateful for the GPS. I mean, and my father has terrible sense of direction, had my mother horrendous sense of direction. But in poems and in books in general, I was always able to pattern, to locate. And I feel that particular ability is what is creating the space to associate loosely, but profoundly, hopefully. And I think that's what's interesting to me often about poetry is those loops and that silence that happens in between, because it's almost like you're getting access to someone's mind in the strangest way, in the purest way, meaning I see this. It's like the Rorschach. What do you think, or what does that lead you to? And I think that also what I do. Not that anybody's asking, but what I do is to produce poems is I free write a lot, and by free writing, what I mean is almost like automatic writing, where I'm just allowing my mind to unspool longhand, and I'm almost training myself to make those kinds of associations that aren't necessarily explicit or immediately obvious, and so I think that's part of it, is that my boot camp of the longhand free writing that is totally low stakes, and I would be mortified if anybody ever saw it, because you would think I was completely sentimental and deranged, which is maybe a little bit true. But I suppose I can form it eventually into something coherent that the hope is that it arrives at, I don't know if I use the word revelation, but something that's brushing up against it. And I just trust that associative process. But I think that's the nature of the writer, is what do you think of after you wrote this? Or what do you think of once you've thought of this? And that's, I think, the strange nature of the genre of poetry, is that it's not following a narrative that's external. It's following an interior narrative. And I think that's what makes voice as style of thought, as something particular to the mind of the speaker. But when I reread the poems, I feel the hypnotic quality of the act of making them, meaning I'm in a slightly different state. I had a boyfriend who would, this was back pre-cell phone, and he would call, and periodically when I was writing, and I'd pick up the phone, and he always knew when I was writing, because he said, your voice is different. I don't know what it was, because I can't discern it, but that there's a little alteration happening, which is wonderful.
I was wondering if there were any sections of the book that just arrived and you didn't have to grapple with, and conversely there were sections that you really struggled to things that current form.
Yeah, I think that the initial couple of sections were easier than the later sections, because I only had so much. I don't think I discarded anything. I used everything I had. So the first couple of sections were easier because I had more to work with. The later sections were more challenging because the work thinned out, which is frightening. Because there's something about when I get to the point where I'm ordering, I don't want to write anymore, or I feel like I can't write them anymore. So I think the later poems in the book, the later sections, were definitely more challenging. They were just on a wing and a prayer kind of a thing. That's a good question.
In your interview with the local paper, you said that poetry steps outside of narrative. What are your techniques as a teacher to get students
one technique, I think ekphrasis is an interesting technique, like focusing on an image or moment is useful to step outside of narrative. And I think that in some ways in the interview, I don't think all poetry steps outside of narrative, certainly, but for me what's interesting is to step outside of narrative. And it is really challenging because the way that we speak, the way that we're educated is all through narrative, and we're storytelling creatures, but we're also meaning-seeking and meaning-making creatures. And so I think that the idea of moment or image is probably, and meditating on moment or image is probably the best way to transcend narrative. But I don't think everybody certainly needs to do that. For me, it was important because the stories that I had to tell I was not interested in the external narratives, and or there were none that were useful for me. So I think that's also what's challenging about, I don't know if the genre, so to speak, but at least the way that I am engaging with the genre, because we feel safe when we're told a story. And when traditional story is removed, I think there's a feeling of dislocation. But that's what I'm interested in, is that dislocation. And I hope that through that abandoning the narrative, that there are stranger, larger truths that can be accessed. And that's something I think, and I was trained for that. I mean, when I was a kid, I was the only child, shocking, to do this. I feel like that's a good training, to be an only child and have to entertain yourself. But my mom was gone. She disappeared when I was a baby, and was gone for years. We had no idea what she was. So I had this experience as a person of having this massive absence, but no story, no narrative at all. And so I lived in this absence of narrative, with this very weird pressured loss and absence. And so that's sort of that was my training as a person, and of being in the world. And so I think that's what leads me to not be interested in narrative. And frankly, that when I did achieve the narrative, it was unsatisfying. It didn't make sense. So it was useless. Not useless, but close. More confusing. Yes.
Did you set out to write all the poems with the same title, or when did that start to make sense that they should all have the same title?
I've always struggled with titles, so it's a little bit of a cheat. My first book, all the titles were Degas paintings, sketches, sculptures, so I got out of it that way, which is great. And then my second book, no titles. This book, no titles. So I just am not interested in titles, or that's not true. It's challenging, and it felt, with these poems, it felt reductive to have titles. And so I think, but when I started writing, it wasn't like I started with titles and then stripped them away. They were written in a way that initially lacked titles, and then I just kept pursuing that. And I didn't have a title of a book. It wasn't that I had a conscious umbrella title either. I'm just, as usual, just feeling around in the dark and seeing what will emerge. But people don't like that, by the way. It's like my experience in sending out individual poems. That's not really something that editors, it seems, embrace, so I wouldn't recommend it. But for me, it was the most authentic way I could do this. And I like the idea. One of my mentors, my professor, is James McMichael, when I was at UC Irvine. He writes these series, and I said, why do you write in a series? Why do you? And he said, because I don't like. He said something like, I like to continue. I don't like it to end and to have to begin again. And I think as poets, sometimes there's an obsession with beginnings and endings, like how fabulous that I can begin and end over and over again. But there was something in him saying that. I thought, oh, good. It doesn't have to end. I can stay in this one space and unpack it and unpack it and unpack it. And to me, that was exciting. That there could be this almost like long-term relationship with the work. At that point, writing the individual poems that had titles, and I call them four-corner poems, was less satisfying for me at that time. And again, I'm not promoting it. I'm just I love individual poems. I sort of envy now because I feel like I've not lost the ability to do it, but I feel less in touch with the ability to conclude and move on. I'm like a novelist. I'm kidding. I wish.
Yes, a few words that repeated throughout the manuscript or phrase.
Yeah.
Were I want and maybe and I mean.
Yes.
What are your relationships to those words?
I like the idea that I think certainty is an illusion, and specifically for the poet. I mean, the idea that the space I'm moving in is a blurry space, in this space of being unsure. So the maybes come from that. It also opens up insight for me to say maybe, because I don't have to commit, and I can consider. I mean, I think is also I think a signal that I'm trying to articulate, but I'm failing. So the repeated I means, I think, for me, are always about trying to get closer, trying to reassert. And what was the other one? The maybe, I mean, I want. What else is being alive about, right? I want. And I think that I like the nakedness of I want saying it. I mean, which is part of, like, to me, what was interesting about writing these poems is the feeling of stripping away ornament or subterfuge, or, you know, just sort of being frank. There's a freedom in that. And the want, I think, also is unfulfilled, of course.
That's like a follow-up question. Did you ever feel like I'm being too frank, or these are too sentimental? And how did you deal with that?
I never thought them too sentimental, because sentimental to me seems oversimplified. And to me, the poems never felt simple or oversimplified, or the emotion. But frankness, yes, I think I felt concerned, about that. But I think also, I don't know if this is to me like a peripheral answer. I wrote these poems, I didn't show them to anybody. That's not true. I have one friend that I show them, some of them to, periodically. But I didn't workshop them, they were private. So in that sense, the frankness, I think there was a space to do that, and also a space free of judgment. And I was workshopped since I was like 16 years old. I love it, it's fantastic. But I also got exhausted by it, and eventually, which is healthy, I think it has a shelf life, and there's time to retreat. And so in that sense, that wasn't a concern privately. I think once the work goes out into the world, there's a kabillion concerns. What have I done? What is this? Is anybody going to be interested in this? And then I think the frankness I was most concerned about is a colleague of mine eventually read the work, and I had this other epigraph. It was, I can't even remember who it was by, it's eluding me right now. But it was somebody's daughter in her suicide note. But it was elusive. And the colleague said to me, "Who's the speaker? Is the speaker this woman in the epigraph?" And I'm like, "Oh no." And then I realized, I maybe need to be a little clearer about the position of the speaker. And so I think the frankness I was most worried about was in the epigraphs, which were to my father and then to the 4 women who took their lives within a year. I was nervous about that frankness, but her confusion about who the speaker was encouraged me to be plain in that way, and especially because the poems are so elusive in their own way, that I felt that I surrendered to the fact that because it was the truth of the space that the speaker was articulating from, that would be useful to be frank in that way. My previous book, Small Porcelain Head, is actually a response to my friend's suicide. She was the beginning of the suicide contagion, and I didn't mention anything about, I didn't have an epigraph, I didn't do anything like that. I recoiled from that for various reasons. I didn't want it to be limited by this suicide. I wanted it to be, and I don't know if I regret that or not. I don't know if I regret being that frank in that. I don't. I think because it's the truth, and because it locates the book, I think, in a way that's necessary. But that I did worry about, because it's so heavy and it's so bizarre. But yet that's where the speaker is articulating from. So that was, I think, and I think also that was at the end of the process when I was like sending it to my publisher and starting to think about it being actually an object in the world and what a reader would be experiencing. And I suppose that's also a question of sentimentality as well, of too muchness, which is another definition of sentimentality, versus oversimplification, a too muchness. But it's like it was too much, it is too much. So maybe that balances out the sentimentality, is fact.
Williams define sentimentality as redundancy, which I always thought, it's just a brief passage.
Oh, that's good.
So I've always thought of the opposite being movement.
The opposite being movement?
Movement, which could be intellectual or imaginative or certainly tonal.
I like that. It's unnecessary. Redundancy, meaning it's already been.
Cultural redundancy that's already made.
Yeah.
Made thoughts of your
I like that. I have to think about.
One thing I noticed, this doesn't make you self-conscious because
it's over. Self-consciousness is done.
Because when you were talking about cohesion and completeness, you kept making this figure of a circle, which is actually a figure of tyndall of the ring, as something, a safe space, but also a secluding space. There's a profoundly ambivalent attitude toward finishing things.
Yes.
You don't want to die, but you want to finish, you say, in one particular poem.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking about your method where you do the free writing, so you start with some degree of chaos.
Yes.
I assume you essentialize things and you create these openings so that it is alive.
Yes.
Versus the death instant, compulsive thing.
Yes.
Okay, so it's interesting that you find this adequate sense of chaos that you can live with, that's beautiful and summons us, right?
Yes.
Actively as a reader. And then it seems the appeal of the long book is that you can have even more chaos and it will come together somehow, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It will come together adequately. But do you ever work the other way? Does it ever seem too coherent and you need to blow it up?
Yes. I think not with this book, but in the next manuscript that I wrote, I did worry about too much coherence and trying to shatter it. Because the redundancy or the sentimentality, if it's too coherent, then it suggests something, that risk has not been taken, or there's not a sufficient amount of vulnerability to create for me what is alive. That the speaker is not terrified enough to say something interesting. So I have this manuscript called The Wendy's that is in 5 sections, and it's focusing on 5 different Wendy's in the culture. And I thought, oh, that's neat, But in that sense, I tried to take the hammer to that even, and definitely tried to make it stranger, just to entertain myself. And I'm not interested. I remember at the end of my MFA program, I figured out forgive me, if this sounds odd, but I feel like I figured out how to write a poem. I felt like I figured out what my talent was, and I was bored. Not for a few years, but eventually I was bored. And so I think that it's my own, I'm trying to interest myself. I'm trying this process to discover something. I'm trying to, what is this, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. I'm trying to engage myself, and I'm trying to, as I think often we do, write the book that I want to read, write the book that I need, and that book is not redundant or ordered in the way that you're describing, that it should feel, for me, most interestingly feels as if it's escaping me and I'm following it. And that's the idea of talent. I was like, oh, I have talent. Like, I can make this thing. And now I know how to make it. And great. I remember my professor, one of my professors at UC Irvine, he's like, show me some new work. And I'm like, okay, this is my third year. And I brought this work to him. He's like, it's great. And I'm like, yeah, I don't like it. Like, I don't like, so like it was, I had this moment where it didn't matter anymore, getting that approval, or even endorsement mattered less and less and less. Because if I'm not interested, and it's poetry, right? It's not going to make a bunch of hash or something. Like, it's like I have to be engaged and interested as a human in the work. And so, I don't know if that's answering your question, but it is, but smashing it, and I like what you said, like appropriate chaos. Because if it's fully chaotic, then then I'm completely lost. But there needs to be some sort of chaos that I can articulate into. Or try to. Maybe. I want to.
Don't you think there's some things that you're certain about? Like, did the Holocaust happen?
Yes, they're facts. But I like what Louise Glück says. She says what we're after in poems isn't the actual, but the truth. Like, the actual are facts, things that are discernible. But she argues that the truth, we know that, the truth is not measurable, right? She says that's why artists suffer. And she says, but we know the truth. Like, I wish I could just put these through a Scantron machine and get an A. That would be great. But it doesn't really work that way. Or a B+. That's good. But she says that we know the truth because we experience the rush of awe, wonder, and horror. And that's the only way we know it. And so that's interesting to me. But facts, sometimes the actual serves the truth. And sometimes it doesn't, which is the beauty of poetry, is that we can slant things to serve the truth or reach for it.
So truth transcends particularity.
Yes. I think so. But yeah, there's things I'm certain about, like facts of my life, facts of the world, yes. But certainty beyond that, if you live long enough, like everything unravels that I was certain about. And it's like things I thought for sure wouldn't unravel. I hope my marriage doesn't unravel. That's like the one thing I'm like, this thing, I hope that lasts as long as possible. Like, I want that. If I can have that certainty of all certainties, I want that. But the precariousness of being alive, is that we are in the moment and things happen that we could not imagine. I had the line in my second book, once I thought what could happen was only what I could imagine. And that was revelatory for me as I wrote it, about like a loss of innocence. And that is, I think, the space that poetry, for me, is written from, is post-innocence, post-certainty. So hence, maybe.
Oh, one more.
Yeah.
One more question.
When you're beginning, do you write longhand, sketching out, or do you use a computer or tablet, or write yourself notes? How do you start?
I've been doing this for years, and it's a Thomas Lux exercise. I bought this book called The Practice of Poetry, which I got through the first 3 pages of, and it's just a series of exercises. The first exercise was Thomas Lux exercise, and he said, write freehand for 10 pages. Not all at once, but like until you get 10 pages. And then go back once you're done, however many days it takes you, and then use a highlighter and highlight words, phrases, images that you feel are interesting, and then maybe from there try to write a proper poem. And I did that, and it was so effective for me, so freeing, that I've just continued that practice. So I have a spiral notebook, and I write longhand in bed at night and just let my mind unravel. And I love that because it's very low stakes. It's very, it takes very little. I can be exhausted and do it. And then I just do that for however many days in a row, and I go back and find things, and weirdly there are these connections and relationships and patterns, and that's been, I started doing that 15 years ago or something like that, and that was just so effective and so simple for me that I've continued to produce that way. But eventually I'll move to the computer and write a poem. But all that other writing for me was like, it's just, and like I said, I'm not showing it to everybody. It's weird. It's useless for the most part. And I usually end up I have this one line. I'll sometimes start with the line. I have this line. This is the room I've made to wait in for you. So I'm like, okay, so I just start with that and then see what happens. And then when that burns out, I just write it again. This is the room I've made to wait in for you. And just see how that moves, how that, just continuing to mine and unpack that. But that's my security. I feel like I could always do that. And I like to doodle, too. I love to doodle. So I like to draw just while I'm thinking and drift away and come back. And that's been extremely generative for me for a very long time. And I'm grateful for it because of its simplicity. So thank you, Thomas Lux, for that and for other things. What's that? I know he's not here. I don't know where he is, but thank you. Yeah, maybe he is. But that's so longhand. And I have to write in pen. I used to write in pencil, but I do have this husband, and he sits next to me in bed, and he can't stand the sound of the pencil. So I have to write in pen. So that's my one surrender. I accept it. That's a great question. I love that question because it's so easy to answer. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.